Hayek would have been worried that the lockdowns and other mandates and interventions were done without adequate understanding and appreciation of the complexity of the economy and society that are being locked down.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Essential Scholars Podcast. I'm Rosemarie Fike, your host, and today I'm going to continue my conversation with Don Boudreaux about the work of F.A. Hayek, and we're going to talk a little bit more about his ideas and how they apply in a more modern context. What kind of problems are we facing today where we might need a healthy dose of Hayek to help us sort through them? Don is a professor of economics at George Mason University. He is the Martha and Nelson Getchell Chair for the Study of Free Market Capitalism at the Mercatus Center. He is also a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute and the author of our Essential Hayek book. You might have read his blog, Cafe Hayek, or one of his regular columns in the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, but we're very excited to have him back to talk about Hayek some more. Welcome back, Don.
Thanks. It's fun.
So one of the things that we kind of left off, or what I started to say in the introduction is, what are some areas today where Hayek's ideas could really be useful? What kind of policy conversations can we really benefit from some Hayek?
So there's a specific answer and a more general answer. The specific answer is, and this is still kind of some deep surprise to people of my generation and older, the return of socialism as a favorable idea in the minds of a lot of people a lot younger. It's kind of shocking to those of us who were so gleeful when we watched, as much younger people, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union just a few years later. But now people are talking favorably as if, well, socialism is well, let's try socialism. We know in the past academically it didn't work out, but we'll get it right this time.
It's not just a small percentage of young people. Depending on what poll you look at, it's like 50 to 60% of younger individuals really support moving away from a market-based economy.
Good point. And so I think this is a very troubling development. And one thing we didn't talk about in our first podcast, but we can mention it now, is some of Hayek's most important work. All of his work coheres, it ties together, but some of his most important work was done during the 1930s and early 1940s on what was called the impossibility of socialist calculation. So there was something back then in the first half of the 20th century called the socialist calculation debate.
And for listeners, you might want to go back and listen to the podcast with Chris Coyne on the Austrian School if you don't quite remember what the socialist calculation debate is. But Don, please talk about Hayek's role in this important conversation.
Well, I'm sure anything Chris said was more accurate and deeper than what I'm going to say. But I also sure we'll agree. So in 1920, Hayek's mentor, Ludwig von Mises, wrote a now famous article saying, look, all these socialists, they have not explained how is it that a socialist economy, the producers in a socialist economy will know how to produce all the things that consumers want. Forget about knowing what to produce. Let's assume that socialist planners know that consumers want hamburgers and hot dogs and furniture and but how are they going to do it? There are many different ways to produce any of these things. And if you don't produce them in the most efficient ways, then resources are going to be wasted, meaning that we'll have fewer resources to produce outputs for consumers. And so Mises said the way this problem is solved in the capitalist economy, in a market economy, is through market prices. We talked about in the first time together, we talked about the importance of market prices. So market prices that can exist only when you have private property in capital goods, when a producer of a machine sells the machine to the highest bidder, owners of raw materials sell those raw materials to the highest bidder. Those resulting prices tell producers how scarce one particular input or intermediate good is compared to how scarce alternative intermediate goods or resources are. And by being guided by these relative prices, producers can pretty much get right how best to produce things. Well, in socialism, because they promise to eliminate private property in the means of production, you're going to eliminate market prices in the means of production. No one denies that. That's the point. It's one of the points of it. And so Hayek said, Hayek taking off, Mises, he said, yeah, that's right. With socialism, the disruption, the suppression, in this case of pure socialism, the absolute elimination of the price system, means that there'll be no way to rationally calculate how best to produce different goods and services, and that will mean a vast amount of waste and poverty.
But don't we have experts under socialism? Aren't the experts going to be in charge? And aren't the people who have experience making automobiles going to be the automobiles are?
Yeah. So Hayek made a big deal. I think he's absolutely correct. That what experts know, experts are experts in engineering. So an expert engineer can know the alternative ways of producing an automobile. Well, we can use this kind of metal to produce an engine, and use this other kind of metal to produce an engine. And then the first engine will have this property, and the second engine will have that second property. Experts can know that. Experts in how to build a car, can't possibly know what the supply of tin is relative to aluminum, relative to the supply of carbon fiber, relative to the supply of magnesium. And you need to know these relative scarcities in order to know which resources to use most intensely compared to which resources to conserve for other uses. And there's no expertise. There can be no expertise in that, precisely because the knowledge of all these relative scarcities is literally spread across the globe. And so we need to rely upon people on the spot to access the local knowledge of how scarce a particular material is compared to other materials. We need to rely upon people around the globe to access those things, and then to convey that knowledge to the people who need it. And how do they convey it? Well, they convey it in the market through buying and selling. The resulting prices conveys the knowledge, as we talked about in our earlier discussion. With socialism, because it eliminates prices, you don't get that conveyance. And so this is a particular. If people would understand today what Hayek and Mises wrote about the impossibility of rational economic calculation under socialism, they really understood it. That would vastly temper a lot of the enthusiasm that people have for socialism. It's just unworkable as an economic system. And let me add, it doesn't have to be full-on complete socialism in order for the unworkability to kick in. The moment we start obstructing the ability of prices to reflect relative scarcities, we throw more inefficiency than otherwise exists into the economic system, meaning more resources are being wasted, more opportunities for production are being foregone. And so if you only do a little bit of intervention, you're not going to destroy the economic system. You have just a little bit of inefficiency. You might not even notice it. But that doesn't mean it's not there. And at some points, it's going to become noticeable. And so, number one, Hayek's argument about the unworkability of socialism would be something that I think would be really relevant today for people to take more cognizance of. A more general point is one I mentioned in the earlier discussion that you and I had, Rosemarie's, is Hayek's appreciation of the complexity of the economy. The economy looks simple to us because it works so well, and because we have aggregate statistics on it. Oh, well, the expert can go to some government agency online and find out what GDP is this month, or what the inflation rate is this month, how much steel is used to produce automobiles as opposed to how much steel is used to produce farm tractors. We can get these data, and that makes it look really simple. But all of these data that we have access to, however useful they themselves are aggregate statistics. Beneath these data are a vast amount of individual complex decision making that gives rise to these numbers. And no genius, no expert, no matter how intelligent and hardworking, can possibly understand all the processing and the complexity of the processes that give rise to the economy that makes our lives possible. Just appreciating the fact that the world, and specifically the economy, is much more complex than it appears. It's much more complex than simply saying labor and management and government. The steel industry, the auto industry, the leisure and entertainment industry. It's much more complex than saying these words. And if we fail to understand that complexity, then we would tend to think of the economy as being very similar to like a child's set of building blocks. Well, a child's set of you can deconstruct this particular arrangement of building blocks and reconstruct them in another way, which might be better. But when you understand that the economy is far more complex than children's building block arrangement, you understand the dangers of trying to rearrange society in the way that a lot of people want to rearrange society. It's going to create horrible unintended consequences.
So from Hayek's perspective, given this very complex nature of the economy, more complex than even economists can understand, really, what advice would he offer for economists, or what role did he view the economist as playing in society?
So the role that he envisioned for the economist as scholar, as theorist, as opposed to the economist as public spokesperson, was to study the spontaneous order of the economy, but to do it in recognition of this complexity. There's still a lot we don't know, and there's still a lot of we don't understand the full ways in which different economic incentives interact with each other to create unintended outcomes. Hayek was a big fan, although he himself didn't do a lot of it. He was a big fan, I think appropriately so, of economic history. Well done. Using what we know about economic theory tells us about what happens when you have different economic institutions and economic changes. We can go back in economic history and make better sense of the facts that we learn from history. We can reinterpret those facts and maybe get insights. You certainly get more insights from them when they're better interpreted. The role that he had, and he was both. He was more of a theorist. He didn't write a whole lot for the general public, a little bit, not a whole lot. But he recognized there was an appropriate role for the economist as public spokesperson. That role, Hayek argued, was, not surprisingly from what we just said a moment ago, was to remind the general public of how complex society is, and to warn the general public against utopian schemes. It sounds good. It's utopian to say, well, we'll take all the money that the rich have, and we'll build, infrastructure. We'll redistribute it. Sounds good, and someone can imagine it all working out in our heads. We can imagine almost anything. And Hayek basically warned us. He said the economist should tell people that what they can imagine in their heads does not necessarily map onto what can be achieved in reality.
So what do you think Hayek would say today in terms of, is he optimistic or pessimistic about whether we're on the road to serfdom?
I think, this is speculative, of course, I think if he were alive today, I think he would be pessimistic. But it's interesting that toward the end of his life, he was actually optimistic. He lived long enough. Well, he lived long enough to see the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. He died in 1992. But in the mid and late 1980s, he was still writing some stuff. And I just happened to read a newly published, for the first time, a version of his closing remarks to a 1984 meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in Paris. And in there, he expressed optimism. He said, the developments in recent years, by which he meant the growing acceptance of resurgence of Austrian economics. I'm sure the fact that he got the Nobel Prize, and public choice economics was becoming more accepted. Jim Buchanan would win the Nobel Prize 2 years later in 1986. So he was made optimistic by the young scholars that he saw at that time, and he said, if we can hold out for another 15 years, he thought the prospects for the world would be great. And this is before the actual collapse of the Berlin Wall. But I think today he would be pessimistic. He would look at this new enthusiasm that we talked about a moment ago for socialism. He would look at the new enthusiasm that exists not only on the political left, but increasingly on the political right in the United States for industrial policy, which is simply another form of socialism light. Right? We're not going to plan the whole economy, just significant parts of it. He would look at this, and I'm sure he would interpret this as reason for pessimism. What's happening? Why did I spend my life explaining the dangers of intervening into the complex social order that is the market economy, only to have people now talk about these interventions as if they're easy to carry out? And so that's the world we're in now. It's important, I think, to add to discuss what Hayek meant and didn't mean by the road to serfdom, because it's often misunderstood. Hayek did not mean by the road to serfdom what many people mistake him to have meant. He did not mean that once the government takes the first step of intervention that's inconsistent with classical liberal principles toward serfdom, that we're destined to wind up where the Soviet Union was in the mid part of the 20th century. It's not what he meant. Hayek says instead that if we continue to believe, there are many different ways to put what he meant by the road to serfdom. This is one of the ways I like to put it. If people continue to acquiesce in having the government violate classical liberal principles, in having the government to intervene to achieve a particular concrete goal in ways that violate classical liberal principles, violate property rights, restrict freedom, if that attitude continues, if the attitude of, yes, if ever there's a concrete goal that the government can solve today, the government should solve it, and let's forget about principles. As long as that attitude persists, Hayek says, we will move down the road to serfdom. But we're not destined to continue with that attitude. And so much of Hayek's pleas, I think, can be best understood as pleas to regain an appreciation for the importance of sticking to principles, regain an appreciation for the importance of saying, look, yes, there is this particular goal that if it can be achieved today, that would be nice. But to achieve this goal requires violating classical liberal principles, and that will create a precedent that is very dangerous down the road, because we won't be able to resist the urge to violate those principles again in an even worse manner tomorrow when another problem arises. And so I would say, I'll just use an example that some of your readers, some of the listeners may agree with, others will disagree with, but I think that the COVID restrictions, even if we all agree that locking down today is a way of saving lives, No one doubts, no one can possibly doubt. It's an incredible violation of human liberty. It's a great intrusion into the market order. Hayek, I think, would say, yeah, so maybe it was worthwhile, but beware that once we've taken that step, once we've violated the principle for that purpose, we are more likely to violate principles for somewhat less important purposes in the future. And as long as we do that, we are marching down the road to serfdom. So let's regain our commitment to principles and not only stop, but to reverse the march down the road to serfdom.
So those principles that you mentioned, private property rights protection, what were some of the other ones?
So, basic things. Private property rights protection, of course, bears a particular weight of importance because protecting private property rights means that each of us get to separate mine from thine. Each of us gets to say no. I can say no to Jeff Bezos, even though he's vastly richer than me. I don't have to use Amazon. I like to use Amazon because he makes good bargains, but I don't have to. But freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the sanctity of contract. I borrowed money from you. Now I don't want to pay it back. And so the government can come in and make my life in the short term much better off by saying, oh, Don, I relieve your legal liability to repay Rosemarie. And then at that moment, it's just a transfer. You lose what I gain. Right? So at that moment, it's just it's a zero-sum transfer. But in a longer run perspective, and I'm using language now that Hayek didn't use, but I think it's language that he would agree. The point is one he certainly would agree with. In the long run perspective, of course, once that particular contract is violated, it'll be easier for the government to violate contracts in the future, which will make it then more difficult for people who need loans to get loans because people are going to be less willing to lend. Well, when I loaned money to people in the past, the government arranged for them not to have to repay me. Well, I'm not going to lend money now. So I think just the basic principles of private property, freedom of speech, freedom of association, sanctity of contract. These are simple in a way, but are vitally important foundations upon which liberal civilization rests. And if they are chipped away at, certainly if they're removed wholesale, liberal civilization cannot stand. It will collapse.
I'm glad you brought up the example of the government's response to COVID-19, because I am curious, what would a Hayekian response to a pandemic situation look like, or what might a Hayekian response look like?
So as you know, it's a great question, and I don't dare speculate what Hayek himself would have said were he alive in 2020 and 2021. And also, as you and I and the listeners know, the responses of different people to the pandemic and to government's own response to the pandemic differ greatly. And so I don't want to presume that my own prejudices, my own attitude are ones that the true Hayekian would have. But I will say that I think this should be uncontroversial, at least just as a positive analysis of how Hayek himself would have analyzed it, that Hayek would have been worried that the lockdowns and other mandates and interventions were done without adequate understanding and appreciation of the complexity of the economy and society that are being locked down. This is the theme that you and I have hit several times in our discussion. But one of the reasons that I personally, from early on, was fearful of the lockdowns and vocally opposed the lockdowns was not that I was in favor of people dying. Right? Of course not. It's because it seemed to me, and I stand by this, it still seems to me that this was the case. It seems to me that people who advocated lockdowns did not adequately appreciate the complexity of the market processes and social interactions that they were obstructing with these unprecedented blockages of human interaction, and so I worried that that those obstructions would have incredibly damaging consequences. I think they have had damaging consequences, and I also worried, and I continue to worry. This is a point to tie it to a point we were making just a moment ago, that the precedent that has now been set will come back to haunt us. Oh, well, we locked down when COVID came, and people will argue that it saved lives, or at least delayed fatalities. So we have this new virus, COVID 2022, or whatever, and so we have to do it again. And look, it didn't lead to the utter destruction of humanity that some hysterical people predicted. So we can do it again. So I worry about the precedent that has been set. So I do think Hayek would say, you cannot lock down an economy and fail to appreciate the complexity of what you're destroying and what you're interfering with, without being willing, or without incurring what are sure to be unanticipated difficulties down the road.
I mean, it seems pretty obvious that the COVID restrictions are major impediments to how the market process works. And I think I wasn't alive in the 70s to see, gas shortages, but I was alive a couple of years ago to see lots of things disappear from shelves and in the grocery store to look very different than what I'm used to it looking like under normal times.
An analogy I've often used, is, like all analogies, it isn't perfect, but an analogy I've often used is a jetliner flying through the sky. So, to the naked eye, it looks pretty simple. It's a jetliner. Of course, the naked eye doesn't see all the complex interactions of the pieces of the motors. And I would argue that a modern economy is far more complex than a jetliner. But a jetliner is flying through the sky, and someone says, "Oh, let's turn it off for a while." You turn it off, and we all know it's going to fall, but we'll turn it back on before disaster strikes, right? So your jetliner is flying, you turn the engines off, well, the thing starts falling, and maybe once you could turn the engines on and then sort of restore the thing to flight before it crashes to the ground. But that's a very dangerous move. And so, in a lot of ways, the COVID lockdowns were like turning off the engines of this incredibly complex jetliner, the market economy that was running along pretty smoothly in early 2020. And we just said, no, let's just shut it all down, shut most of it down. And I got to say, what surprised me, and this is, I said earlier in a different context, as I've grown older, I've become more and more impressed with the robustness of market processes. The consequences of the shutdown, I think, it still remains to be seen. It's still playing out. The consequences have not been as calamitous as I thought they might have been. I think we're seeing very bad consequences. I said I don't apologize at all for opposing the lockdowns and for the reasons that I did. But I'm impressed by how robust the market is at recovering. The profit motive is a wonderful thing. If people are willing to buy things, people are willing to go into business to make and produce and supply those things. And so we might get out of this much less scarred than I initially feared, but we won't get out of it without any scars at all. We will have the scars, I think, Rosemary, for the rest of your life, certainly for the rest of my life.
Definitely something that was unprecedented, for sure. One thing that Hayek kind of talks a little bit about in his work is social justice and the incompatibility with social justice goals and market economy. But today, social justice is very much a part of public discourse with, Me Too movements, Black Lives Matter, climate and environmental justice, income inequality. Is there nothing that we can say about social justice from Hayekian point of view?
Yeah, I'm an unreconstructed Hayekian on this point. I know a lot of some of my libertarian friends disagree with me on this, but I think Hayek is correct both in a positive and in a normative way. Hayek's point, comes up most clearly in Volume 2 of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, which is subtitled The Mirage of Social Justice. And Hayek says, look, justice is absolutely essential for a good society. But justice by its nature cannot be social. Justice is a term we use to describe how one conscious being acts toward another conscious being. Well, society is not a conscious being. And we court all kinds of error when we suppose that society is a conscious being. And so Hayek says, we want justice. Justice is me giving you what is due to you. And that, of course, depends upon the relations we have with each other, contractual or not. And that's where we should look for justice. What is called social justice is outcomes that appear unlikable to some people. In some cases, these outcomes are nothing other than the unavoidable results of trade-offs that are made. So pick an example. The average wage average earnings for women working in the workforce is lower than the average age for men working in the workforce. Just all women, all men. And so some people say, well, this is an example of social injustice. Right? And Hayek says, no, it's not. We didn't have society choosing to pay women less than they pay men. If we want to understand why this happens, why we get this result, we have to look at individual choices. And we may find that this outcome is the result of unjust individual choices, but we may find differently. And as I think you'll agree, what we find when we look at individual choices, we find that this pay difference dramatically shrinks. Women with the same level of education, working the same career paths as men, they get paid virtually the same as men. Women choose, for whatever reason, some of them obviously biological, women choose to stay out of the workforce on average more than do men. You stay out of the workforce, you don't get the work experience, and so that's going to have an impact on measured average earnings of women, even if you as an individual woman have never chosen that particular career path. So Hayek says, I'm going to back up. Hayek says, look, because society is not a sentient creature, society is not capable of being just or unjust. And it's dangerous to then treat society as if it's something we can scold and correct and punish or whip or reward in order to get it to be more just or unjust. If there are outcomes in society we don't like, we have to look at the micro foundations of what causes those outcomes. We may discover that in some cases, well, those outcomes, they're not the result of any injustice after all. We might discover that, in fact, they are the result of some injustice. And so the best way to correct those is at the micro foundation to do whatever we can to get people to behave more justly toward each other. But justice is inherently an individual matter. And I think Hayek was right to insist on keeping justice, recognizing that justice is an individual matter. Because, in a way, if we don't, it kind of relieves individuals of having to be just. Oh, it's not my fault, it's society's fault. Well, no, society's not a sentient thing. It can't be not the fault of anything. There was an old, I'll use an analogy if you don't mind, there's an old, very ancient concept in English law called deodand. And so a millennia ago, 1,000 years ago, if you're walking along, you're walking beside someone's barn, and the barn happens to collapse and fall on you, or the bull breaks out of the barn and kills you. Then the bull gets blamed, and we slaughter the bull, as if the bull or the collapsing barn roof has a mind of its own. And we know now that this is silly, right? I mean, if the barn roof collapses, it's not the barn's fault. We want to look for the individual actions that cause the barn roof to collapse. They may be blameworthy. They may not be blameworthy. Same thing with causing the bull to escape. And so, but if we go about punishing the bull, thinking that we've done the job, okay, we're going to punish the bull, we're going to punish the barn, then we miss the real causes, and it allows us to excuse the actual individuals whose actions brought about these outcomes that we justly dislike.
I think that's a very interesting perspective for sure. One thing I would kind of maybe push back on or ask a little bit more explanation about is that a lot of modern social justice movements are not necessarily about redistributive justice, but they are about thinking about how maybe the concept of individual rights have not been perfectly applied to all groups. So to the extent that we might be able to alleviate some social justice concerns by extending those rights more broadly, that to me seems more that seems to be consistent with what Hayek would want.
So, here we're disagreeing then over the utility of the term,
semantics and things.
Right? And I think what Hayek would say, he would certainly agree with that end, the goal that you just described. But what he would say, and I would agree with him, in that we have to be, language carries meaning. Language carries not only the immediate obvious meaning, it carries a certain valence that gives impressions. And I think Hayek would warn. So, if we talk about social justice, that inevitably conveys the impression that there's this separate thing called society that is doing this. Mm-hmm. And that diverts our attention from the actual causes of what is bringing about these outcomes that we dislike. Mm-hmm. And so by all means, let's have justice. And by all means, let's make sure that everyone in society is treated equally. But if we call unequal treatment social injustice, then we're blaming some abstraction that doesn't have a brain, doesn't have a will, doesn't act. We're blaming an abstraction, and that diverts our attention from where that attention is better focused, and that is on the individual structures, the individual decision making, the individual constraints and opportunities that bring about these outcomes. So you think back. I'll pick a fairly uncontroversial one now. You think back in post-Civil War America with Jim Crow legislation, right? And so some people say, well, this is social, social injustice. Maybe that's a harmless term, that blacks were denied access to certain occupations to which whites had access to. But we know now why that existed. There were certain whites who used the legislative process to enact statutes that prohibited blacks from gaining access to these occupations, that punished whites who would violate these statutes. So the injustice was not societies. The injustice was these individuals who were doing what they were doing. And that's where we should focus the attention.
Okay, I like that. One of the things I always like to ask my guest is, what are some of the ideas or one big idea that you think is very misunderstood about Hayek? And so I know we talked a little bit about the road to serfdom. That's a pretty misunderstood idea. Are there any other ideas that, in communicating them to more modern audiences, that maybe Hayek's message has been distorted a bit?
Yeah, so you mentioned the big one. The big one is what Hayek meant by the road to serfdom. We've already talked about that. I think a second distortion of his misunderstanding of his ideas, and I've seen this misunderstanding evinced by people on the political left, people on the political right, people in the middle, is this notion that people will say something like, well, yes, Hayek was very brilliant in explaining why socialism can't work, and we accept his idea now. But no one today is talking about returning to the kind of central planning socialism that Hayek was arguing against in the 1930s and 1940s. We're talking about a milder form of socialism, democratic socialism, and so Hayek is not relevant here. Now, I mentioned this before, but it's worth emphasizing again. Now, I think Hayek is relevant because the core of Hayek's argument is that against socialism is that when you obstruct commerce particularly in the means of production, you distort the information that producers need in order to produce efficiently. This sounds cold and technical, but if you're distorting information that producers need to produce efficiently, that means you are encouraging producers to wastefully use resources, to produce some output using more resources than would otherwise be necessary, meaning you have fewer resources left to produce other things to satisfy human needs. And so I would argue that Hayek's arguments against socialism do not kick in as relevant only when we're talking about full-fledged classic socialism of the sort that the central planners of 100 years ago wanted. Hayek's arguments against socialism apply today, and they apply with just as much force even to these more modified forms of socialism that people are now all enthusiastic about.
You give a great example in the videos that accompany this Essential Hayek book. You talk about chocolate-covered pickles, which I think is a great, hilarious example. But it made me think about, subsidies and the extent to which, the government tries to encourage the market to innovate in particular directions. Let's subsidize renewable energy operations. So I think there's definitely a lot of ways, even when we're not pursuing what we think of as mild forms of socialism, just regular policy interventions also have this characteristic of diverting resources away from what people actually want.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there are increasingly large numbers of people now on the political right, the national conservatives, as they are now dubbed, and dubbed themselves. A lot of these people on the right, they're all enthusiastic now for industrial policy, and they of course don't want to be called socialists, but their policies are in fact a form of socialism, not full-fledged socialism, but a form of socialism, and they should be rebutted as such.
Well, I know Hayek has been a huge influence of yours. Is there anything you think that Hayek got wrong?
I think Hayek overplayed the importance of his trade cycle theory. I think it can explain why a downturn might persist. I don't think it can explain the persistence of many depressions. I don't think Hayek got much wrong, actually. But I say that because Hayek, no one has been more influential. No one has been as influential in my thought as Hayek. So I kind of consider myself to be this living carrier of Hayek memes. And so I'm not really the person to I look at the world through Hayekian lenses. I think they are very clarifying lenses, but I'm aware that we all have lenses, and lenses, no matter how clarifying, also have their biases.
Well, one thing I love about you is that you do take the time to communicate these really complex ideas to diverse audiences with different levels of understanding, which is not something our profession always rewards, but you do take the time to do that. And I think you've done a great job today and in our previous discussion of boiling down Hayek's ideas and making, his ideas can be really difficult to understand, and you've made them really accessible. At the end of the Essential Hayek book, you give a great list of recommended readings, not just for the advanced student, but for introductory students as well. Aside from those readings, do you have any recommendations for people who are interested in learning more? Your blog, Cafe Hayek, might be a useful resource, but any other blogs, any other kind of videos?
So these are coming out constantly. One of my favorite blogs, Cafe Hayek's a favorite blog, but I write it. econ log, which is David Henderson and Scott Sumner and Pierre Lemieux. Econ Log's a very good blog. It's one that I read. I think a lot of the essays published at AIER now are excellent. And I hesitate to say too much because I can't cover everyone. And a lot of people whose works I admire that I'm not going to say. But I mentioned one other book that it's going to sound a little bit off kilter, and it came out after The Essential Hayek was published. But Russ Roberts' book on Adam Smith, how
Adam Smith can change your life.
Yeah. Smith was very Hayekian, or Hayek was very Smithian, and that's a wonderful and a wonderfully accessible book for, I think, conveying the wisdom that Hayek and Smith shared and that they believed was essential. Topic of the title of these videos, it was essential for people to understand in order to have a flourishing, peaceful, liberal society.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Don. We really appreciated chatting with you today, and I hope to be in touch with you more in the future. I always am reading your blog, and as a Pittsburgh person, Pittsburgh native, also a fan of your column.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's been fun and enlightening. Thank you.
You've been listening to Essential Scholars, a new podcast series that explores the ideas and insights of some of history's most influential thinkers. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe and head over to essentialscholars.org to learn more. See you next time.